the open portion. First of all, we don't need to co-opt anyone. We've got a quorum. Confirmation of the minutes. Someone can move the minutes of Thursday, 26th August. Thanks, Alderman Zuko. Put that to the meeting. All those in favour, it's a true record. Against, that's carried. There are no supplementary items. Indications of pecuniary and conflicts of interest on the open. There being none. Transfer of agenda items. No, so I'll move into the report proper. The only report on tonight's agenda, Antarctic Cities project completion, and welcome. And look forward to the presentation by Professor Elizabeth Lean. Thank you very much. Would you like to come up to the table? We're all friendly.
You're welcome to go up close to the screen if you'd like to. Would you like me to give a brief intro?
And maybe an introduction of the people here too.
Yes, certainly. I think Alderman Zuko and Alderman Sexton and Alderman Thomas will remember that we agreed to co-fund this project back in 2017. So this has been an ongoing project. Council at the time resolved to give 3 years of financial and in-kind support to this project, and so I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Elizabeth Lean here today to present. So we have Alderman Zuko, Alderman Sexton, Councillor Dutta, and of course Alderman Thomas. And online, sorry, yes, we have Councillor Ewan.
No, Fox.
Oh, beg your pardon, Councillor Fox, yes. So this has been really interesting to watch how this project has grown over that time. And Elizabeth will go into a lot more detail than I will, but I think from my perspective, and I think from Council's perspective, this completed report has landed at a really interesting time for us, particularly in the context of the city deal and Antarctic being part of that. But I think in many ways this project has delivered the type of outcomes that we were hoping it would. It's talked very much about that role of the city as a gateway or custodian, and has also really gone deep into our community's connection with the Antarctic. And we know from previous work over many years around the community visioning exercise, we've always had an idea that the community actually felt very proud of this Antarctic connection and the fact that the orange boats are in the harbour and so on. So I think there are many, many things in this report that are well worth us unpacking, and that's why we've made the series of recommendations to you that we have, because we think there's a really significant body of work for us as a council now that we can take from this and go forward with. But yeah, Elizabeth, if you'd like to take over and take us through.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for taking the time to listen to me. And you've all got the report, so I'll give an overview for about 10 minutes and touch on some of the key outputs of the project. So the project had 3 key aims, and the first one was to really explore the way that we think about the Antarctic gateway cities, and of course Hobart's one of them, but there's also Christchurch in New Zealand, Punta Arenas at the tip of Chile, Ushuaia down the bottom of Argentina, and Cape Town in South Africa. And that idea of a gateway is really good for describing how people and things move through the city and back to it on the way from Antarctica. But we don't think it really does justice to the full relationship of the city with Antarctica. So we wanted to use this idea of custodianship, of citizens who really care about Antarctica, who have a sense of responsibility for it, who want to protect it, and to see if we could deepen that gateway concept through the idea of custodianship. The second aim was to rethink the relationship between the 5 cities. So they're often thought of as in competition, isolated places that compete with each other for Northern Hemisphere traffic, but we thought they had a lot to learn from each other, and being a group, they could exchange information. And we wanted to contribute directly to strategic planning and policy processes on Antarctic matters in the cities, and particularly in Hobart and Christchurch. So to give you an idea of what the project was, it went from 2017 to 21. It was funded by the Australian Research Council through their linkage grant scheme, and that's a scheme that links universities with businesses or community, or in this case government. So we had a series of partners. Hobart City Council was the key partner, but also Antarctic Tasmania, Christchurch City Council, the Antarctic Office in New Zealand, and the Chilean Antarctic Program. And we did focus on those three cities, Punta Arenas, Christchurch and Hobart. The other two were involved to some extent, but they were our key focus. We had a series of chief investigators, academics, led by Juan Salazar, who's at Western Sydney University. You can see him closest to us in the black and white photo there. But UTAS also played a really big role, and so did universities in some of the other gateways. So there are a whole series of outputs. As you would expect for a research project, there are a series of academic outputs that you can see there. There was an associated PhD, which is still ongoing. And there was a fair bit of public engagement as well. So over 150 media pieces over a whole range of different media. In each of the cities, we did some on the ground kind of engagement work. You can see some examples there from Hobart. And of course, we produced the report, which we hope is really user-friendly. It does come with 3 further volumes, which are only available on PDF for people who want a little bit more detail. But what we were really interested in were the tools that we prepared for our partners. And there's a whole range of these, and the idea is that the cities take whichever tools they think are most useful and adapt them to their own benefit. And there's way too much here for me to talk to in 10 minutes, so I thought I'd just run through the first 3 really quickly and then focus a little bit more on the last 3. So one of the tools was urban sustainability profiles for the 3 cities of Hobart, Christchurch and Punta Arenas. So the idea here is that to be a custodian for Antarctica, a city has to have its own act together, so to speak, in terms of sustainability. And we used a technique that was developed by Paul James, one of our investigators, and applied to 50 cities throughout the world, initially through the UN, which produced these sustainability profiles, graphic representations of the sustainability of the city in 4 key areas: ecology, culture, politics, and economics. And that's a graphical representation, but behind that sits an awful lot of data and focus group and interview work, about 100 pages in volume 2. So the city can use that to see how it's going in terms of its own sustainability and to compare with the other gateways, for example. Now, related to that, we produced an Antarctic Connectivity Index, and that's a way for the city to measure, if you like, its degree and kind of relationship with Antarctica, because the cities do have fairly distinct kinds of relationships with Antarctica. And it does that in 4 domains, again, ecology, culture, politics and economics, and within those there's 7 subdomains, and within those there's 7 more subdomains. So there's 196 factors, ways of connecting with Antarctica that we look at in this index. And that's all written up in volume 4 if you're interested in the detail, but essentially it's the way for the city to monitor the intensity and kind of its connection. And then the next thing we did was an online serious game called Antarctic Futures. Now this is a resource for young people. The user essentially makes a whole series of policy decisions in the game and tries to save the world by 2070 in the face of a whole lot of challenges, mostly around climate change and centred on the Antarctic. It's not flashy, it doesn't have fantastic graphics as you would for a game that you threw millions of dollars at, but it is a way of starting debate amongst young people. Now I'll talk a little bit more now about those last 3 tools, the surveys that we did, the Youth Coalition and the Draft Charter of Principles for Antarctic Cities. Those ones. All right, so surveys. So these were designed to get a sense of citizens' opinions about their cities' ways of connecting with Antarctica, because we don't often actually ask our citizens how they connect with Antarctica. I think this was the first time we've sort of systematically done that. So we did 3 separate surveys in Hobart, Christchurch and Punta Arenas back in 2018, and then taking some of the things we learnt from that, we did a joint 5 cities online survey last year. So the Hobart survey back in 2018 was 300 people. It was a telephone survey, and the results are published in an academic article in a journal called Geographic Research. Happy to send copies if anyone's interested, but I just pulled out some of the key findings here that struck me. For example, a large majority of people, over 80%, believe that Hobart's Antarctic connections are important to the city's economic future. But the strongest finding was in response to that idea that the city should play a custodian role in terms of Antarctica's future. And we got over 90% agreement on that, with almost 50% of people strongly agreeing to that proposition. We asked them about things like threats to Antarctica. So Hobartians were most concerned about climate change and ice melt, perhaps no surprise. And then they were concerned about commercial activities, possibly thinking of fishing, possibly thinking of tourism, maybe even mining, depending on what they thought about the future of the treaty. And then the third one was geopolitical tensions. And this wasn't the same in the three cities. For example, in Punta Arenas, geopolitical tensions ranked higher. That's just, I'm not going to go into the detail on this, but that's just to give you a sense of all the kinds of detail of the data that we've got from this survey. We asked 50 questions, half of them about the city itself, half of them about the Antarctic. Questions around historical connection, future visions and so forth. So we can pull up a lot of data on particular things that interest the city. And then we have the cross-city survey. So this was over 1,600 people across the gateways, and it produced some really rich data that can be drilled down to for each city. Again, some striking results. A large majority of people, over 70%, considered Antarctica important to their city's identity. And that was highest in Ushuaia in Argentina and lowest in Cape Town, with Hobart in between, but it was actually pretty closely bunched. But what was interesting was that nearly as many people, 66%, felt ill-informed about the Antarctic. And that was a lot higher in our youngest age bracket, went up to over 80%. So people think Antarctica is important to their city, but they don't feel like they know much about it. So that suggests there's a kind of educational piece that we need to do, or some kind of public awareness, a public engagement piece. So I just wanted to give you a sense of the sort of data that we produce. This is from our dashboard. That's that question about how informed you feel, although that's for Hobart there. So 67% of Hobartians feel little or not at all informed about the city's relationship with Antarctica. But in the other graph, over 80% feel some degree of responsibility for its future. So again, a mismatch between those things. This one asked, in your opinion, is Antarctica important to your city's identity? 72% of Hobartians surveyed thought it was fairly or very important. And when we asked them what things should you focus on to develop an identity in relation to Antarctica, the top ones were environmental protection, urban brand, tourism and jobs. They could choose more than one of those things. I thought this question might interest you because it's about the roles of institutions in Hobart's future relationship with Antarctica. So people thought that most strongly agreed with scientific institutions playing an important role in that relationship. Perhaps not surprising for Hobart because we have so many Antarctic scientists here and scientific organisations, but also civil society, local government. 80% of people thought that local government should lead the development of a plan to integrate Antarctica into the future of the city, with 36% strongly agreeing. And last came the private sector, but all of them fairly high results there. So there's a lot more data to that. We asked, I think it was 28 questions, and we can drill down on any of the cities. We can compare cities, we can drill down for gender, we can drill down for age bracket. So lots of information if you're interested in it. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Right, so moving on to the next thing, I want to talk about quite a different thing, the Antarctic Cities Youth Expedition. So I mentioned that young people feel ill-informed about Antarctica particularly, and we also found from our surveys that they feel quite disempowered about what they can do for Antarctica, even though they care passionately about it. So in addition to the game, one of the things we did was we selected one young person from each city through a competitive process and took these 5 young people to Antarctica, down to Escudero Station, it's a Chilean station on King George Island off the Antarctic Peninsula, going via Punta Arenas, and that's where you can see the 5 of them there. And there they learnt about each other's cities, they learnt about the scientific research being done, they looked at the physical environment, the impact of climate change is quite clear on King George Island, and the living conditions of various stations that we visited. You can see down there in the bottom right, that's me with Chloe Power, who is our Hobart Youth Ambassador. They also undertook a series of guided workshops while they were in Antarctica toward developing a youth network in and across the cities. And the result was the Antarctic Youth Coalition. You can see its logo there, cities connecting through Antarctica. So the vision for this coalition is for cities to come together to embrace the values of Antarctica for the protection of our shared future. So they want to build a network of young custodians across these cities advocating for the continent's future by promoting sustainable behaviour in their own cities. And you can have a look at it on the website there. It did hit a big hiccup in the form of a pandemic. When we came back from Antarctica, it was late February 2020. So that was just when things were hitting. So a lot of things we had planned couldn't happen. But we do think that the coalition could have legs if we put some momentum behind it. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was a draft charter of principles for Antarctic cities that we developed. So these really build from that 2009 statement of intent that the Hobart City Council was involved in with the other cities, but give some ways of outlining a common vision, narratives and priorities in their relationship with Antarctica. And it can be adapted really flexibly in each city to produce specific actions for that city. And it's structured as 4 top-level principles, again, in those domains of ecology, economics, politics and culture, but it drills down to 7 second-level principles and 7 third-level principles. So again, there's 196 principles there that you can have a look at in volume 4 if you're interested. Ways for the city, principles for the city to build its relationship with Antarctica around, and actions that can be taken under each of them. So there's really a lot of information there. Our key recommendations, firstly, that we take this term custodianship that really struck a chord with so many people and translate that from being an academic concept to a practical way for citizens to relate to Antarctica, to encourage that sense of caring for this place. That the cities establish an international alliance. We've called it an Antarctic Custodial Network, but it could have another name. Could take many forms. I'm happy to talk about what that might look like. And that the methods and the findings continue to be used and adapted as the cities find useful. So that was a bit of a whirlwind tour, but I hope it's given you a taste for what we've done, and will entice you to have a look in our reports and the PDFs that go with them.
Well, thank you very much. I'll open it up to committee for questions.
Read.
Councillor Dutton.
Thank you very much for your report. I do appreciate it, even though I haven't read the whole thing in detail, which I intend to do later. But with regards to the sense of caring that you mentioned, you know, what do you think constitutes the elements of caring and how it can be done?
Yeah, well, I think in this project, a lot of it is around connecting sustainability in your city with the sustainability of Antarctica. So acknowledging that what we do here has a real impact on Antarctica, because of course our behaviour is what's having the biggest impact on ice. But I think that also involves, I think that caring, I think you have to know something to care about it. So I think it also involves a level of awareness, a level of what I would call Antarctic literacy. And I'm not sure we've really got that, either in the Gateway or in the broader population, but if we should have it anywhere, it should be in the Gateway. But our survey showed that we don't. So I think behaviour and sustainable behaviour and knowledge go into that idea of caring.
Can I ask to the Director, you've given us a set of recommendations which call for some form of business plan or proposal to come to us. Have you had discussions with the project developers as to what our contribution might look like? What does success look like to you?
Well, to answer the first part of your question, I guess we've not had specific discussions with the project team exactly what next. We wanted to see how this report landed. I think success to me looks like a more formalised approach from the city around its approach to the Antarctic. So in terms of I'm thinking a dedicated strategy around the Antarctic that would encompass both economic and social and potentially environmental. And that's why I said in my introductory comments, I think the timing of the landing of the report in the context of the city deal, which of course involves both the Australian and the state governments, is actually really helpful for us. And I feel that this report gives the city much more leverage in that discussion around what sort of role we can play going forward. Because as the report outlines, of course, we've had a very strong civic connection to the Antarctic, probably, or well, certainly in my time here for the last decade, through hosting particularly the reception to send off the expeditioners each year and our involvement with the TPM. I mean, of course, the city's involvement with the Antarctic dates back to when the first expeditioners left here. But I'm of the view, and I think the team is of the view, that there is scope, if council's willing, to have a more active role than just civic. And that's why we've made the recommendations to you that we have. We feel there is scope, if you're happy, that we look to develop a strategy that would give us a more encompassing role.
Okay, thanks, Director. Councillor Fox, have you got anything to add or to question? No? Sorry, Alderman Zuko.
Yeah, one of the questions I have is the financial implications. There's nothing here in regards to that. I think before we really sort of go too far forward, we need to know what the bottom line is. So I'd like to see the financial implications over the next coming years.
Yes, absolutely. As part of coming back to you with any thought around a strategy, it would be costed.
And the other thing is whether or not the state government is going to be associated in any way, shape or form.
Can I, through you,
Yeah.
Chair, can I answer that in two parts, because I would like actually, Elizabeth, your comment around that as well. From our perspective, as I said, I think through the city deal, it's time for us to have this on the table as part of the city deal discussions, to bring the state government more firmly into this thinking. But I'd be interested to hear, Elizabeth, from your perspective. Obviously, you've worked with some of the state government level bureaucrats in the Antarctic. How do you feel that this has been received and their level of input and, I guess, engagement going forward?
Yeah, I had a meeting with them a couple of weeks ago to talk through this report, and got a very positive response. One of the things that we found in the project is it sometimes feels like the idea of public engagement with Antarctica and citizen engagement falls through a hole between Antarctic Tasmania and the city and the AAD, with none of them having responsibility for it. So I think it would have to be something that was, kind of several organisations coming together to address, or at least in partnership, because at the moment it feels like no one's really in charge. And of course Macquarie Point was constantly on our minds, and we met with Mary Messina as part of this project, just because we knew that there were plans for an Antarctic and Science Precinct, and we're really keen that take on some of the findings from our project and have a really kind of hands-on experiential component for citizens that isn't just looking into a glass-fronted lab or something like that. And we'd like for the university to be able to have some input into what that might look like. And this research project, I don't know if that's stepping beyond our bounds, but we think we have a lot to say about how Hobart could really ramp up its identity as a gateway and its engagement as a gateway. And going to some of the other gateways, you sort of see other things that are done differently and think, oh gosh, there's something that we could be doing, or Punta Arenas feels a lot more Antarctic than Hobart, for example. There are ways in which we could make this city more Antarctic, and that's for visitors as well as citizens. And I think I haven't mentioned tourism, but there's a kind of gateway tourism component to this too, of people coming to Hobart and experiencing Antarctica vicariously through the city, that I think, despite the HUT, despite TMAG, despite a lot of great things, we're not doing in a holistic way at the moment.
Well, I'm going to move two amendments. One is 4.1, because there's a report to be brought back at council highlighting proposals more strategically aligned, blah, blah, blah. But I'd like to have 4.1 that the report also include the financial implications in respect of this proposal. Now, I don't know whether to put it into 3.5 or just add a 3.7 that the engagement process also include the state government. It's not unless you've got it somewhere hidden. I can't see it. So,
Chair, through you, actually, it probably is slightly hidden. 3.5 refers to the Tasmanian Antarctic Gateway Advisory Committee.
yeah.
So that is a group that's auspiced by the state government.
Yes.
Of key.
I'm talking about a higher level.
Yeah.
That's I'm not being thing, but I'm talking about a higher level.
Well, in that case, Chair, through you, I think it is appropriate that a 7 gets put in.
Put a 7 in that the Hobart City Council engaged directly with the relevant appropriate minister.
Yes.
I think it needs to go at a higher level. Okay, so they're my 2 amendments on this.
I have a question. I understand the interest in changing the term from gateway to custodian, but I guess I would need to understand the implications of that. As I understand it, the term custodian implies taking responsibility for protecting or caring for.
Yes,
And whilst I have no problem with the city caring for and doing its best to protect, I'm not 100% sure whether we have the responsibility for that. Or the power. I mean, you don't have the responsibility, you don't have the power. And or responsibility without power is just a mechanism for blame. So you have to have the power in order to do something, otherwise you'll just get the blame if something's not achieved. So I think we have to understand what we mean by that and what we are prepared to do about it, and whether or not we can wrestle responsibility from those that would believe that they have the responsibility for the Antarctica to such an extent that we can live up to the term.
Chair, through you, that's why the wording for part 3 talks about evaluating. For that very reason, we suspect there's a little bit more work to do there from our perspective.
Yep, okay.
Good. All right. Well, Professor, thank you for your submission, and thanks for all that great work over the last few
Thanks so
years.
much for the other amendments.
Yeah, well,
So I'll move the whole thing with those 2 amendments. That would add a substantive motion.
moved by Alderman Zuko. Are there any comments on the amendment or on the substantive? Thank you. I'll put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? That's carried. Thank you very much. I'll move now to item 7, which is simply the committee action status report. Thank you. Any questions in relation to the status report? No. I'll put that be accepted. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? It's carried. Questions without notice on the open? There being none, I'll ask someone to